Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Welcome everybody to our weekly class on the Bhagavad Gita. Last time we stopped on Shloka 47 of chapter 2, a very famous shloka, Karmanye Vadikaraste Ma Phaleshu Kadachana. So let's look at that in the app. Ma Karma Phale Hetu. Okay, so I'll have you guys repeat it once more just because I want to start with that actually first. There are a couple things I wanted to mention which I didn't last time. It's a very important shloka. Okay, so chapter 2, verse 47, please. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the quarter by quarter. Please repeat after me. Karmanye. Okay, we're not all there yet. Okay, hold on. Well, we'll give you a second. Everybody ready with the app? Okay. Karmanye vadikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phalahetur bhur bhuhu, and then with sandhi it's bhur, yeah. Ma te sangos tvakarmani. Okay, so just to refresh your memories about the meaning of this, please look at the Anvaya again. Anvaya meaning rearrangement of the words to make it easier to understand the meaning. Karmani eva, to work, indeed. Te, adhikaraha, is your adhikara, your right. You have the right to the action, the work. Ma kadachana phaleshu, but not to the fruits of your actions. Okay? Karma phala hetuhu ma bhuhu, never make the motive, the hetu of your actions, karma phala, the fruits of your labors. Mate akarmani sangaha astu, but don't also become attached to akarmani, to inaction, to laziness, to inactivity. Okay? Now, there are a couple things I wanted to mention here. First of all, last time I mentioned this briefly, but I want to just repeat it because it's an important point. Shankaracharya, who was the great philosopher of Advaita Vedanta, he wrote a great commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which is full of insights. But sometimes he arguably misinterprets the shlokas in order to make the shlokas conform to his own philosophy. This is at least a common accusation leveled against him by scholars and others. Now, I want to raise a question about his interpretation of this shloka. How does he interpret it? He strongly emphasizes the word adhikara here. Okay? Karmani eva adhikara hatte. Sri Krishna is addressing Arjuna and saying, you have the right to action, but not to the fruits of actions, right? And now, in Shankara's philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, there's a very important doctrine called adhikari bheda. Notice the similarity in word, adhikara, adhikari, same. Adhikari bheda is the doctrine of differing spiritual competencies. According to Shankara's school, so long as we have impure minds and minds that are distracted with worldly thoughts and all those things, we are only eligible to practice karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action, unattached action. But just hypothetically speaking, if we do a lot of spiritual practice and we ultimately are able to purify our minds and concentrate our minds, we get promoted to the higher level of spiritual aspirant, the higher grade of spiritual aspirant. Those are the people who have very pure minds, who are eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, the path of knowledge. And that has a specific meaning in Advaita Vedanta. The idea is that, do you guys know what Mahavakyas are in the Advaitic tradition? What is an example of a Mahavakya? Very good. Aham Brahmasmi is one of them. In fact, that's the one in our order, Ramakrishna. I am that non-dual pure consciousness. According to Advaita Vedanta now. But this is a mantra taken from Brihad Aranika Upanishad. Now, what is Jnana Yoga? It's Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, based on these Mahavakyas, like Aham Brahmasmi. What does it mean? Shravana means you hear from a qualified Advaita Guru this great Mahavakya. I am Brahman. Then Manana, next step. I reflect deeply, I think deeply about this Mahavakya. And think about objections. Well, how can I be Brahman? I'm this, I'm just an ordinary fellow, this and that. Think about it from all standpoints, remove objections, strengthen your faith and belief in that idea. And finally, Nididhyasana, you internalize that idea that you are Brahman by trying to assimilate it and practice it in your daily life. So, but the key takeaway here for Shankara in this context is the same person cannot practice Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga at the same time. There's a doctrine in traditional Vedantic schools which was actively discussed and debated. It's called the doctrine of Jnana Karma Samuchaya. Jnana means the path of jnana, knowledge. Karma, the path of Karma Yoga. Samuchaya means combination. And Shankara school rejects Jnana Karma Samuchaya. Shankara school does not believe that a single person can simultaneously practice Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga. Why? The answer is simple. Because they're meant for different grades of spiritual aspirant. If you are an inferior spiritual aspirant, what's called Manda Adhikari in Sanskrit, then you're eligible to practice Karma Yoga. If you're a superior spiritual aspirant, which means you have a highly purified mind and concentrated mind, then you're eligible only for Jnana Yoga, and not for Karma Yoga. So the same person should not be practicing Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga at the same time, because it's not logical from Shankara's standpoint. Okay? So now with that in the background, now we come to the shloka. Now what does Shankara say about the shloka? He says, see, Arjuna is a warrior, and he does not have a sufficiently purified mind. He's not a Brahmin, that's one of the reasons, but there are other reasons too. And so, not coincidentally, not surprisingly, Bhagavan Krishna tells Arjuna to practice Karma Yoga because he's an inferior spiritual aspirant. How do we know this? Because he uses the word adhikara. And Krishna is saying, you have the right to karma. And Shankara will add, as opposed to, you do not have the right to what? Jnana Yoga, exactly. You have the right to practice Karma Yoga, but you do not have the adhikara to practice Jnana Yoga. Now, here's a question for you, and I'd like your opinion about this. Do you find this to be a plausible interpretation? Why or why not? Of this shloka? Look at the first line, especially. Look at it closely. What does the first line say? Krishna says, you have the right to karma, karmani eva, but not to the fruits of the work.
Right is between action and fruit, not whether Arjuna and...
Very nice, exactly. At least that's my intuition. But if other people have other intuitions, I'd like to hear them. Exactly, because the line says, in the first line, Krishna says, you have the right to karma, but not to ma phaleshu kadachana. If Krishna had said, you have the right to karma and not to jnana, then Shankara's interpretation could be plausible. But it's saying, Krishna is clearly laying out the two options here. And the other option is the karma phala, desiring the karma phala, not wanting to practice jnana yoga. Does that make sense? Okay. So, but again, I want you to think about these things for yourselves. But this is one reason why some scholars find Shankara's interpretation of this shloka and some other shlokas in the Bhagavad Gita unconvincing. Next thing. We talked about this a little bit, and I'm afraid that maybe I was not as clear as I could have been. So I wanted to mention it again, because it's a very important issue. When you're trying to practice karma yoga, And we're told by God himself, Bhagavan Krishna, when you act, you should not covet the fruits of what you're doing. This could easily lead to misunderstanding and confusion, because I think one misinterpretation of this teaching, Krishna's teaching, would be you should not want to succeed. You should not want to, if you're a doctor, you shouldn't want to save your patient. That's a very concrete example, and it's a very stark example, right? But that sounds weird for a doctor who's a surgeon, right? His lifelong commitment is to help patients, to help them try to save their lives. If you don't want to save their lives, what do? Do you do a bad job? Do you do it in a, sort of like lackadaisical manner? No, that's not the idea. The way I see it is, the aim of karma yoga, according to Bhagavan Krishna, is you don't do it for the sake of success. You don't do it for the sake of name and fame. You do what you're doing because it's your duty and because you want to do it to the best of your ability. This is the way I see it. And you leave success or failure up to God, because it's not in our hands. And if you've done your best, if you can really say I've done my best and you still fail, if you're a karma yogi, you won't become distraught by it. Even if, in the case of being a doctor, your patient dies. It's a devastating thing. But if you've done your best, you have nothing to feel guilty about. Do you see what I'm saying? If it's malpractice, that's another issue. So, okay. Now, then, the second line, I wanted to point to one thing here before we move to the next shloka. Ma karma phala hetur bhuhu. The motive of your action should never be a desire for the fruits of your actions. Karma phala hetuhu. Mate sangaha astu akarmani. But don't also become attached to inaction or laziness. Okay? Don't think that because you shouldn't covet fruits that you should be a kind of like people who smoke too much marijuana and don't want to do anything. They've lost motivation to do anything. It's not like that. Now, an interesting question comes up. Bhagavan Krishna in this verse is saying, don't make the motive of your actions be desire for fruits, like success, like name and fame, like a perfect score on your exam, the #1 student in my class, and this and that. But what should the motive be? So far, Krishna has not discussed what is the positive motive? What should motivate us to engage in actions as a karma yoga? Should there be no motive at all, or should we have some motive that's different from desiring karma phala? So now Shankara says something very interesting. He says, this is why we need the next shloka. He says that in this shloka 47, Bhagavan Krishna is saying what the motive that we should not have when we engage in karma. If we're true karma yogis, we should not covet the fruits of our actions. And that in 48, Shankara says, Krishna tells us what our motive should be. So let's look at shloka 48. Yogastaha kuru karmani sangam tyaktva dhananjaya siddhya siddhyoh samo bhutva samatvam yoga uchyate. Okay. Anvaya. He Dhananjaya, O Arjuna, Sangam Tyaktva, having abandoned, having renounced, given up all attachments. Sangha means attachment. Asakti. Siddhi asiddhyoho samaha bhutva. Siddhi means, in this context, success. Asiddhi means, guess what asiddhi means? Exactly, failure, success and failure. They come as a pair. Being samaha to both success and failure. What does samaha mean? Equal. Being equal. It sounds a little weird in English to say being equal to success and failure. You can say it. I think Sri Aurobindo does. But maintaining equanimity in the face of both success and failure, something like that would be more long-winded, but maybe little bit prettier English. Okay. Having done that, yoga stha karmani kuru. Stha here in a compound word in Sanskrit means you're standing firm in something, standing in. Standing in what? Yoga. Yet again, we get the word yoga. The word yoga probably comes up more frequently in the Bhagavad Gita than any other word. So there's always this question of what yoga means in a particular context. And then different commentators have a field day in arguing. No, it means this. It's bhakti yoga. No, it's jnana yoga. No, it's karma yoga. Okay. So standing firm in yoga, karmani kuru. You should engage in action. Samatvam yogaha uchyate. This is one of several definitions of yoga that Bhagavan Krishna gives us. Samatvam yoga uchyate. What is yoga? Yoga is samatvam. Samatvam meaning equality or equanimity. Even tranquility. Okay, now, Shankara here, as I mentioned, claims that this shloka is giving us the answer to the question, what should our motive be as karma yogis when we engage in action? And Shankara says this shloka is telling us that our motive should be to engage in actions in order to serve and please God. Which seems plausible. And in fact, Bhagavan Krishna definitely does say that later in the Bhagavad Gita. The only issue is that there doesn't seem to be any reference to God or to bhakti here in the shloka. So this raises an interesting question. Karma yoga. Okay, Swami Vivekananda, he has a book called Karma Yoga, and he distinguishes at least two kinds of karma yoga. He says one kind of karma yoga is a theistic or bhakti oriented karma yoga. I engage in actions, and instead of coveting the fruits of actions, I do everything as worship of God. And I do it as a service to God. This is the idea. This idea will come up. You find it in the Gita, but it hasn't come up just yet. And then Swami Vivekananda says it, but there's another kind of karma yoga, which is also mentioned in the Gita. He says there's an atheistic karma yoga. Not necessarily that there's no God. It's not that you have to be an atheist, but the idea is that God doesn't come into play in the spiritual practice of karma yoga in this second form. What is that? Swami Vivekananda says you just have to cut off all attachments to the fruits of actions without depending on any higher power, without calling on God. And he says that's a much more difficult kind of karma yoga, but it's another path. If somebody is deeply temperamentally uninclined to believe in God, then this could be a more suitable path, this kind of non-theistic karma yoga. So now coming back to this shloka, the question is Bhagavan Krishna teaching this non-theistic form of karma yoga? And then later in the Gita, especially starting in chapter 3, we'll find it very explicitly stated. Karma yoga is based on bhakti. Whatever you do, do it for me, Krishna says, and don't covet the fruits of your actions. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which is the one that Shankara accepts, is that even here in chapter 2, even though bhakti is not mentioned yet, even though God is not mentioned even once, we should just read the later shlokas on karma yoga back into the shlokas in chapter 2. The bhakti idea comes up in the next chapter. We should assume it's already present implicitly in shloka 48 and in some other shlokas in the rest of this chapter. Even though it's not explicitly stated, we should just assume it, and that there's only one form of karma yoga. It's a bhakti-grounded karma yoga. Okay? So again, these are difficult issues to adjudicate, but I wanted to raise both these interpretive possibilities. Is Bhagavan, so just to sum it up, the question is, in the Bhagavad Gita, and you can only sort of really answer the question after reading all 700 shlokas, but does Bhagavan Krishna teach one kind of karma yoga throughout the Bhagavad Gita, which is always grounded in bhakti? Or does he teach two distinct kinds of karma yoga, one which is meant for bhaktas and one which is meant for people who do not believe in a personal God? That's the question. So let's keep that sort of on the back burner and think about it as we move forward. So now, did I go through the Anvaya of this one yet? I did, right? Yes. Okay. Now, one of Shankara's followers, Sridhara, he was a very smart guy. So he knew that there was a kind of a missing link in Shankara's argument here. Shankara says this shloka is meant to explain what is the motive behind the actions of a karma yogi, and it's to serve God, but there's no mention of God. So Sridhara slips it in. How does he slip it in? This is the ingenuity of commentators, you'll see. Yogastha, this first word. Because the word yoga is notoriously ambiguous, Sridhara interprets yoga here, standing firm in yoga. What are you standing firm in? Parameshvara ekaparata in Sanskrit, which means you should be wholly dedicated to Parameshvara, to the Supreme Lord. So he builds in bhakti through the word yoga, which is ambiguous. It's a brilliant move. Because Shankara doesn't actually. Shankara, you know how he interprets yoga? It's very interesting. This is a much more kind of like textually grounded interpretation. Shankara says, what does yoga mean in Yogastaha? It's clear because Krishna himself defines what yoga means in the next line. Samatvam yoga uchyate. So Shankara says we should take samatva as a meaning of yoga in the previous line. But I think Sridhar is worried about this because he says, then where is bhakti? You yourself, Shankara, are saying that this karma yoga is based on bhakti, but then you're not giving me anything to go on. We need to have some bhakti here. So let me reinterpret yoga as bhakti toward the Supreme Lord. And then Shankara's interpretation goes through. But again, the question is that a plausible interpretation? Or do we find Shankara's interpretation of yoga more plausible? Because Krishna here, arguably, he's giving a definition of yoga as samatvam. And if, right, samatvam yoga uchyate. And in the previous line, if the same word is used, one kind of logic is that, well, we should take that to be the meaning of yoga because of proximity, because of context, right? Okay. And another thing I wanted to mention, Sangam Tyaktva Dhananjaya in the first line, having renounced attachment. Attachment to what? Good. So the karma phala, that's one thing, which is the fruits of our actions. I think that there's another thing that you should also not be attached to. Any other ideas? Because I think that's right, but I think that there's a second object of attachment that should also be renounced. Anyone? The work itself. This is also, it can be a bondage. If you become overly attached to one kind of work, that's a kind of bondage, right? It's good to love what you do in a sense, right? I mean, if you're following your swadharma and all that, but if you become overly attached to it, the moment that because of certain circumstances, you're not able to do the work, you're going to become a miserable mess, right? So better to maintain detachment even toward the work. You're doing the work now because that's your duty now, and because the circumstances sort of allow you to do it. But you should not become overly attached to the work either. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, good. So let's move on to the, well, okay, if you're curious about, I keep referring to kind of future shlokas where karma yoga is explicitly framed within a bhakti framework. I'll give you one example. Chapter 3, Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma chetasa nidashi ninmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. Krishna tells Arjuna, Mayi, he's referring to me, and now he's thinking of himself as God, Krishna. Mayi sarvani karmani, all of your actions, what do you do? Sanyasya, Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya. Give up all your actions to me. Do them as a service to me and worship of me. Mayi sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma chetasa, and focus your mind on your inner soul, inner atman. Nirashi ninmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigatajvara. It's a very poetic shloka. Without any expectations or hopes of I want this, I want that, I want to succeed, I want the best grade, I want this, that. Nirashihi, nirmamo bhutva, without any kind of egoism, any me and mine, I am the doer, I'm so great because I did this and that. Yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. Fight. Devoid of the fever of what? Fever of egoism. Jwar in Bangla, it comes from the Sanskrit jwara. So this word vigata jwaraha, devoid of fever, but this is a metaphor clearly. The fever of egoism, of feeling like I'm the doer, I'm great. When you give up your actions to God, you become free, you become healthy, you become free from fever in a literal sense. Sorry, the Sanskrit word for health is a very beautiful one. Swastaha. It means you rest in your own true nature. Okay, so that's but as I said, so far up to shloka 48 of chapter 2, there doesn't seem to be any hint yet of bhakti. Shloka 49. Durena hyavaram karma buddhi yogat dhananjaya buddhau sharanam anvichya kripanaha phalahetavaha. He Dhananjaya, O Arjuna, buddhi yogat karma durena avaram. Karma is far inferior, durena avaram, to buddhi yoga. The yoga of the buddhi, of the intelligent will, is the way that Sri Aurobindo translates buddhi. Buddhau sharanam anvichya. Take refuge in buddhi, in this intelligent will. He, indeed. Phalahetavaha kripanaha. People who are always chasing after the fruits of their actions are pathetic, sad, losers, kripanaha. They are to be pitied. Okay. Now, one thing that's important is there's a huge difference between karma and karma yoga. So we should always ask ourselves when we're doing something, are we doing karma or are we doing karma yoga? What makes karma karma yoga? What transforms ordinary work into karma yoga? So far, what have we learned from the Gita? Yeah, good, exactly. And then later, one chapter later, and then for the rest of the Gita, we'll find Bhagavan Krishna will also add, and doing it as a worship of God also. So these two things, good. So that's, so one can take, so karma here is just ordinary karma, which is far inferior to buddhi yoga. And here buddhi yoga seems to be a synonym for karma yoga. Because you have to use your intelligence in order to engage in actions in the right spirit, in a detached way, without hankering after the fruits, and so on and so forth. And I really like Sri Aurobindo's explanation of buddhi yoga here. As I said, synonym of karma yoga. So I'm going to read this. Unfortunately, time and again, I'm finding that the commentary provided by the app, like in this one, it's grayed out, which means there is no commentary, but there is. But it's in this book, which I have, which is a different rendering of Sri Aurobindo's, a different arrangement of Sri Aurobindo's commentaries on the shloka. So let me read it to you. Sri Aurobindo says in this context, he's explaining buddhi yoga. It is because he acts ignorantly, with a wrong intelligence, and therefore a wrong will in these matters, that man is or seems to be bound by his works. We get caught up in our actions, we get attached, we become miserable because we're not using our intelligence properly. Otherwise, works are no bondage to the free soul. It is because of this wrong intelligence that he has hope and fear, wrath and grief and transient joy. Otherwise, works are possible with a perfect serenity and freedom. Therefore, it is the yoga of the buddhi, this is buddhi yoga, the intelligence that is first enjoined on Arjuna. To act with right intelligence and therefore a right will, fixed in the one, capital O, being the one divine, aware of the one self in all and acting out of its equal serenity, not running about in different directions under the thousand impulses of our superficial mental self, is the yoga of the intelligent will. Because remember, the word buddhi goes back to that Esha Tebhita Sankhye Buddhi Yoge Tumam, Shloka 39. Buddhi is a kind of keynote starting in Shloka 39. And so it's a kind of running theme in these shlokas. So it's very important to understand what this buddhi is. You have to use your intelligence properly to engage in true karma yoga instead of falling back into ordinary karma. Okay? Okay. let's go to any questions before we move on to 50? No. Shloka 50. Buddhi yukto jahatiha ubhe sukrita dushkrite tasmad yogaya yujyasva yogaha karmasu kaushalam. Buddhi yuktaha, being endowed with buddhi, that same intelligent will just mentioned in the previous shloka. Sukrita dushkrite ubhe iha jahati. You should abandon. And exactly what sukrita and dushkrita are is a matter of controversy among the commentators. I'll discuss in a second. But it could mean good and evil. That's one thing it could mean. Could mean good and bad karma. Okay. Tasmad yoga yujyasva. Therefore, you should strive to be in yoga. Yogaya. Again, yoga, this ambiguous word. But fortunately, this time, Krishna himself defines what yoga means. What do I mean by yoga? Yoga ha karma su kaushalam. Yoga is skillfulness in karma. Kaushalam in karma. Karmasu. Skillfulness in action. It's a beautiful definition of karma yoga. Being skillful in action. That's yoga in this context. Now, as I promised, I would mention one word that's a matter of a bit of controversy is, what does Bhagavan Krishna mean by sukrita, dushkrita? Abandoning both sukrita and dushkrita. Ramanuja says that this person, through karma yoga, by doing karma yoga wisely, and by ultimately realizing the eternal soul within, you are able to get rid of the good and bad, what's called sanchita karma, which is the karma stored up from all of your past lives, which would force you to become reborn again and again. Part of the karma is the karma that you have to exhaust within this life, in this embodiment. Sanchita karma is, it's like a savings account, except it's not a very nice fixing. It forces you to have to take up another physical body to work out your remaining karma. And because we've had countless past lives, it's a pretty hefty account. That's why you need, according to Ramanuja, who is a great bhakta, you need God's grace. But that comes later. Okay, but this is Ramanuja's suggestion. What sukrita means is good sanchita karma stored up from past lives, which even good karma will make you come back and get a physical body. Don't think that good karma means you're going to get liberated. Good karma means you'll have a good birth and you'll enjoy yourself. It'll be a nice, happy life. Not always. It's not as mechanical as that. But in any case, a kind of crude version would be like that. Okay, in any case, that's Ramanuja's interpretation. Now, Sri Aurobindo has a bit of a different interpretation, which I find interesting, and I want to read it out to you. This, again, I believe is unfortunately not in the app commentary. It sort of is, but it's kind of ... And let me read it, and you can, if you want, you can try to follow along. It's really not there, so let me read it. Okay, it's just one sentence I want to read. Sri Aurobindo says, what does sukrita dushkrita mean? It means this person rises to a higher law beyond good and evil, founded in the liberty of self-knowledge. So he takes sukrita to mean good and dushkrita to mean evil. What is Sri Aurobindo saying here? I think what he's saying is, see, ordinary people, we have a conscience. What's the purpose of the conscience? Yeah, exactly. Because if I do something bad, this has happened to all of us, you feel guilty. What is it in you that makes you feel guilty? It's your conscience. It nags at you, gnaws at you until finally you have to either apologize to the person or pray to God or whatever it is you do to take care of it. But in any case, the conscience bites, right? But what Sri Aurobindo seems to be saying is, once you evolve spiritually, after a certain point, you no longer are dependent on the conscience. And one problem with the conscience is sometimes we don't read it properly. The ego also enters in and makes us think that the conscience wants us to do something that actually we shouldn't be doing. The ego has a million ingenious ways of justifying itself in its actions. And the conscience is also one way of, yes, 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 that's what you should do. That's what your conscience is telling you to do, but in fact, you shouldn't do. So that's tricky. It's imperfect. That's the point. The conscience, our feeling of conscience is imperfect because we're imperfect. We haven't attained spiritual perfection. But who's the person being referred to here? This is a very, very high state, attaining essentially perfection through the practice of karma yoga. What is the state of this person? That person is beyond good and evil. What does that mean? He or she does not have to rely on his or her conscience anymore, this imperfect instrument, because that person is one with the divine will. You become a perfect instrument of God. So there's no question of, should I do this or should I not do this? Whatever you do is holy. This is the way I see it. But okay. And yeah. Any questions on this one? Before we move on? Okay. So let's look at Shloka 51. Karmajam buddhiyukta hi phalam tyaktva manishinaha. Okay, this is a bit long because it's one word. I have to do the whole thing. Janma bandha vinirmukta padam gachanti anamayam. Good. He, indeed, buddhi yuktaha manishinaha. Those sages or wise ones who are buddhi yuktaha, endowed with this buddhi, again buddhi, it comes up in almost every shloka, this intelligent will. Karmajam phalam tyaktva, having renounced what? The fruits of our actions, again, as usual, karmajam phalam. Janma bandha vinin mukta, being completely liberated from janma bandha, the bondage of having to take birth again and again in a physical body. That's at least one interpretation. It's a standard interpretation, but there are others. But anamayam padam gachanti, and you reach what state does this person reach? This liberated soul, anamayam padam. This state which is totally transcendental and beyond all suffering and misery, anamayam, and all evil. Now, here again, there's an interesting philosophical question. There are other shlokas in the Gita that are similar to this, okay, which raise the same question. The question is, this shloka, just at face value, if we just look at it at face value, it seems to be suggesting that sages, through the practice of karma yoga, by renouncing the fruits of their actions, they attain the highest state of liberation, janma bandha vinimuktaha. They've attained the highest state of moksha. This is what the shloka seems to be saying. But that poses a problem for a number of traditional Vedantic commentators, like Shankara, but also Ramanuja, actually. Because many of these traditional Vedantic commentators believe that karma yoga is a spiritual practice meant for, it's a kind of preparatory practice, but it's not the highest practice, so it can't take you to the highest goal. Shankara says only one yoga takes you to the highest goal. Which is it? Now you should be experts in this, in answering this question. Which is the one yoga, according to Shankaracharya, that leads us directly to moksha? Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. Can you guess, according to Ramanuja, what is the one yoga that takes us to the highest spiritual goal? Bhakti yoga. Good guess. Correct. My big hint 5 minutes ago is that he was a bhakta, so but it's good. You put two and two together. Bhakti yoga. Unfortunately, karma yoga is always the kind of the neglected child in the family. So it's never number one, or very rarely at least. Tilak. It takes until early 20th century, or I think late 19th century. When did Tilak write his commentary on the Gita? Do you know, BG? Anyway, who's a great freedom fighter. So he read the entire Gita as basically a treatise on karma yoga, as a way of also trying to shore up support for the independence movement in India. But in any case, now Shankara, so he can't take the shloka at face value. So what does he say? He says, okay, yes, that's true. What Krishna is saying is true. But what does he really mean? Implicitly, what he's saying is Through the practice of karma yoga, by renouncing the fruits of our actions, what do we achieve? Not liberation, chitta shuddhi, purification of mind. Then we become eligible to practice jnana yoga. We become all renouncing sannyasis. And then we give up practicing karma yoga. We practice the path of knowledge. And then we attain liberation. And Krishna is just leaving out those minor middle steps, but they're implied nonetheless. This seems to be his idea, okay? Again, there's this question of, is that plausible? I mentioned that there are other slokas that are like this. There's another sloka, chapter 3, sloka 20, which is even more direct. Karmaneva hi samsiddhim astita janakadayaha. Karmana eva hi samsiddhim astita janakadayaha. Janaka, the great King Janaka, is a king, actively engaged in all sorts of actions, running his kingdom, this and that, dealing with a million people. Karmana eva hi samsiddhim astita janaka. Janaka and others like him achieved siddhi. In this context, it means perfection, which is another clear meaning of siddhi. How? Through karma eva, karmana eva. Through karma alone. At least arguably the he here means, or the eva. Karmana eva hi samsiddhim. Not that it's karma yoga and then jnana yoga. There's no mention of jnana yoga. I remember having this argument with one of my acharya, monastic acharyas in Beluma, in training center. We have a 2-year training center period, like a center where we're studying the Gita. And we came to this shloka, not this shloka, but the one I just mentioned, chapter 3, shloka 20. Karmaneva samsiddham. And then he's explaining Shankara's commentary in that tradition. Yeah, Krishna means you get chitta shuddhi, purity of mind through karma yoga, then you practice jnana yoga, and then you get liberation. And I said, well, where's the mention of jnana yoga? So aren't we better off interpreting this? And see, our order was founded by Swami Vivekananda. And Swami Vivekananda is one of the few modern Vedantins who believes that karma yoga can also be a direct path to liberation. So my argument was, why don't we take Swami Vivekananda's reading of this shloka, which would be that all 4 yogas, including karma yoga, can be a direct path. Why go into this higher and lower, say only one yoga leads directly to the goal? And then the acharya said, I don't remember what he said, but it was not very satisfying. So, okay. Okay, any questions? I think we have time for one more shloka. Maybe both, but let's see. Let's not rush it. Okay. Yada te moha kalilam buddhir vyatitarishyati tadagantasi nirvedam shrotavyasya shrutasya cha. All right, yadate buddhihi, when. Yada means when. Te, your. Buddhihi, again buddhi, the same word buddhi, your intelligent will. Moha kalilam vyatitarishyati, crosses this whirlpool of moha, of delusion. By practicing this buddhi yoga, we can cross over this whirl of delusion, pass through this whirl of delusion. Tada, then, shrutasya shrotavyasya. These words are extremely controversial. How do we interpret shrutasya and shrotavyasya? So I'll get to that in a second. But shrutasya shrotavyasya cha, so both these things. Nirvedam gantasi, you attain nirvedam, indifference toward both shrutasya and shrotavyasya, the shruta and the shrotavya. And then you ask, well, what is shruta and what is shrotavya? And different commentators give different answers. What is the problem? The problem is this. Shruti, what does shruti mean? Somebody here must know. Yeah. According to Hinduism, shruti means the foundational scripture, the holiest of holy scriptures, the Vedas. And if you're a Vedantin, you mean specifically the Jnana Kanda of the Vedas, which means the Upanishads. Okay? Now, the word shruti is used, but just in a different form, but it's still that shruta. So the most plain meaning, the natural meaning would be, it's shruti that you should become indifferent to when you've attained perfection, when you've crossed beyond this whirl of delusion. But a lot of these Vedantic acharyas, these traditional commentators, were scandalized by this. That can't be right, because the scripture is the holiest of holy things. So you can't become indifferent to the scripture even after liberation. You should always hold these scriptures in high regard. Again, what does nirveda mean? It doesn't mean you're looking down on the scriptures or having contempt for them. But in any case, so what happens is some of these traditional acharyas, they give these very creative interpretations of shrotavyasya shrutasya. I'll give you a little bit of an idea. Shankara himself is actually a little vague, as far as I can tell. I've looked at his commentary. It's not very clear what he means. But to make up for it, his followers, like Anandagiri, he says, yes, it's Shruti. Shankara means by Shruta, the Shrutasya Shruti, except only the Karmakanda of the Shruti. Karmakanda meaning the parts of the Vedas enjoining ritualistic action. So it excludes the Upanishads. So the realized soul should never become indifferent to the Upanishads, which contains the highest spiritual knowledge. No. But you can be indifferent to the ritualistic component of the Vedas. Okay, this is one way of interpreting it. Ramanuja gives another interesting, a very different but still very interesting interpretation. What he says is, Shruta here means heard. It also literally means heard, that which is heard. So in this context, how should we take it? What I have told you, O Arjuna. Krishna is saying, you can become indifferent to what I've just taught you, which is these teachings on karma yoga in the preceding shlokas. It's a very ingenious interpretation. And shrotavya, it just means the future tense, that which will be heard in the future. So Ramanuja says, what does he mean by shrotavya? It means, what Krishna means is, and also the realized soul, the enlightened person, will become indifferent to what I teach you in the subsequent shlokas. But it's not referring to the Vedas at all. This is Ramanuja's way out. Because remember, the Gita is Smriti, but not Shruti. It's part of the Mahabharata. Another follower of Shankara, Sridhara, he comes up with a different interpretation, which is also interesting. He says that no, Shruta means objects of enjoyment, both in this world and in heaven. And he really starts, I mean, as far as I can tell, he's sort of stretching the meaning of the Shruta and Shrotavyasya, but somehow he gets out of it all objects of enjoyment. And so the karma kandins, the people who engage in this ritualistic actions prescribed by the Vedas, their goal is to go to heaven, temporary heaven. Sridhara says the realized soul is completely indifferent to going to any of these temporary heavens. And the realized soul is completely indifferent to any kind of worldly objects of enjoyment, sense pleasures and so on, name and fame. Okay, so all of these are a little tricky. Now, Sri Aurobindo tries to take this at face value, Shrotavyasya Shrutasya. And I wanted to read to you his interpretation. This, by the way, is the full commentary. It's about 600 pages. And so this book that I'm going off of is a rearrangement. I've mentioned this several times. I'll mention one more time. It arranges. It takes, this commentary is not arranged shloka by shloka. That's the problem. And so what Anil Baran Roy does is to take his commentary on specific shlokas and organize them, arrange them under each shloka, like in the traditional manner. So I find it useful. Okay. So now let me read from his Essays on the Gita. Essays on the Gita. Oh, it's called, and you can get it on Amazon if you're interested, Bhagavad Gita and its Message, with text, translation, and Sri Aurobindo's commentary, edited by Anil Baran Roy. And they're different publishers, but the one I have is Lotus Light Publications, USA. Okay, so what he does is he links this shloka to shloka 46. Remember shloka 46 about when there's a flood all around, what is the point in a well? You only need a well when there's a drought, right? But not when there's a flood. It says, what is that saying? That shloka, let's just briefly remind ourselves, is saying, Tavan sarveshu vedeshu brahmanas vijanatah. Here it's very hard to escape the meaning of Veda, because it literally says Sarveshu Vedeshu, Brahmanas Vijanata, that the Brahmin who has realized has attained enlightenment. And when there's a flood all around, the Vedas become like a well in the midst of a flood, no longer useful. Sri Aurobindo starts with that. He quotes that sloka. So let me read. He says, as much use as there is in a well with water and flood on every side, so much is there in all the Vedas for the Brahmin who has the knowledge. Knowledge here means not intellectual knowledge, but spiritual knowledge. Then, nay, the scriptures are even a stumbling block. For the letter of the word capital W, perhaps because of its conflict of texts and its various and mutually dissentient interpretations, bewilders the understanding, which can only find certainty and concentration by the light within. Then he quotes this shloka. When thy intelligence shall cross beyond the whirl of delusion, moha kalilam, then shalt thou become indifferent to scripture, capital S scripture. So he really means the Vedas here. To scripture or heard or that which thou hast yet to hear. Gantasi nirvedam shrotavyasya shutasya cha. When thy intelligence, okay. And then he goes on to explain the next shloka, but I won't read that now. So Sri Aurobindo is one of the few commentators who takes these words straight and says that this shloka fits very nicely with shloka 46 earlier, which specifically mentions the Vedas, Sarveshu Vedeshu, and it goes very nicely with, dovetails nicely with the very next shloka, which begins with the word Shruti. Okay, we don't have time today. We'll leave it on a cliffhanger. How about that? So next time we'll start with shloka 53. Remind me if I forget that I want to focus on this word Shruti again and link it to the Shrotavyasya Shrutasya in the previous shloka, and then Sarveshu with Sarveshu Vedeshu in shloka 46. Okay, the rest of the chapter is extremely interesting, actually. Very good. So let's do a brief meditation, and then we'll call it a day. Sit in a comfortable posture, Sukhasana. Gently close your eyes. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out slowly. Breathe in. Breathe out. Be mindful of the breath as you inhale. Be mindful of the breath as you exhale. Direct your attention to the in-breath and the out-breath. Anytime you become distracted, bring the mind back to the breath. If you find yourself getting distracted, you can count. Every time you inhale, you can say 1, and then after the exhalation, you can count 2 like that. It'll help you to concentrate. Gently open your eyes. This is called mindfulness of breath. It's one of the major kinds of meditation in Buddhism. You find it in the Satipatthana Sutta. That's one of the earliest scriptures that describes this mindfulness of breath. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat.